No tanks roll in. No flags are lowered. No capitulation is announced. Yet control is already gone. In the last 2 years, entire governments have lost the ability to set their own economic policy without a single soldier crossing a border. Budgets are rewritten. Subsidies vanish. Interest rates jump. Currencies are cut loose. These decisions are presented as technical adjustments, but they are not made in national parliaments. They are approved elsewhere. Inside conference rooms where the language is neutral, the math is precise, and the consequences are irreversible. On paper, these nations remain sovereign. Their flags still fly. Elections still happen. Presidents still give speeches. But the most important choices, how much a government can spend, who gets paid first, which citizens absorb the shock, are no longer theirs alone. Sovereignty hasn't been conquered. It's been pledged. This matters now because the scale is unprecedented. According to data published by the International Monetary Fund in 2024 and updated through mid-2025, global public debt has pushed past levels last seen only during world wars. Pandemic borrowing never rolled off. Commodity price spikes widened trade deficits. Then interest rates rose at the fastest pace in 4 decades. The result is a squeeze that dozens of countries did not plan for and cannot refinance away. As of the past year, more than 90 countries have either entered IMF lending programs or opened formal negotiations for emergency support. This includes low-income states and middle-income economies once described as stable. The common factor isn't corruption or mismanagement. It's arithmetic. Debt that must be rolled over at higher rates collides with currencies that weaken as dollars grow scarce. At that point, borrowing stops being a choice. It becomes a condition of survival. The real question isn't whether countries borrow. They always have. The question is, what happens when borrowing stops being temporary? When loans no longer bridge a crisis, but replace a tax base? When repayment schedules outlive political terms? When conditions attached to assistance quietly rewrite domestic priorities? This pattern isn't new. History shows what happens when states lose control of money before they lose control of borders. In late imperial Rome, silver content in coins was shaved down to meet military and administrative costs. The empire didn't fall immediately, it hollowed out. Trust eroded first, prices followed, and authority dissolved long before the banners came down. In Weimar Germany, war debts and reparations forced the state to print to meet obligations denominated in hard currency. Inflation wasn't a mistake. It was a constraint made visible. Today's version is cleaner. No presses run non-stop. No wheelbarrows of cash. Instead, balance sheets do the damage. The Bank for International Settlements has warned repeatedly over the last 18 months about a growing mismatch between dollar-denominated debt and local currency revenues. The Federal Reserve, through its rate policy and liquidity tools, has reinforced that mismatch globally, even as it stabilizes domestic inflation. These are not accusations, they are mechanics. This story is not about villains or secret meetings. It's about a system that behaves the same way every time the numbers cross a threshold. A trap that doesn't announce itself. A transfer of control that feels administrative until it shows up in food prices, pension cuts, and the quiet realization that your government no longer decides first. It asks first. What follows is not a prediction. It's documentation. The damage doesn't announce itself with collapse. It arrives as friction. Groceries that cost more even after inflation is declared under control. Electricity bills that spike without warning. Fuel prices that retreat on paper but never fully come back down at the pump. In country after country, the headlines say stabilization. The receipts say something else. Over the last 18 months, food prices have remained structurally elevated despite easing global indices. The reason is simple and uncomfortable. Many governments now pay more to service debt than they spend supporting domestic supply. When currencies weaken, imports price higher instantly. Wheat, fertilizer, diesel, medicine, none of it waits for policy adjustments. A currency loses 10%, and households feel it within weeks. Debt service is the silent driver. According to the International Monetary Fund, interest payments as a share of government revenue are at multi-decade highs across low and middle-income economies. This isn't abstract accounting. Every dollar sent to creditors is a dollar not spent on transit systems, hospitals, or price controls. Budgets tighten not because officials choose austerity, but because math leaves no alternative. Housing has become the pressure point where this math turns personal. Higher interest rates, driven by global tightening led by the Federal Reserve, raise mortgage costs worldwide. Local central banks follow to defend their currencies, even when domestic economies are weak. The result is a stall out. Wages lag, rents climb, construction slows, and ownership drifts further out of reach. Public housing programs shrink just as demand peaks. Wages tell a similar story. Nominal pay rises get announced. Real purchasing power keeps falling. Inflation doesn't have to run hot to do damage. It only has to stay above wage growth long enough. For most households, that line has already been crossed. Savings erode quietly. Debt fills the gap. The promise is always the same. Hold on, relief is coming. People feel this long before governments acknowledge it. Families cut protein before policymakers cut forecasts. Parents notice school fees rising before finance ministries revise growth numbers. By the time officials speak of necessary adjustments, daily life has already adjusted downward. What deepens the unease is not just the cost, but the distance. Decisions arrive as fate's accomplice. Fuel subsidy removals, tax hikes, currency liberalization, framed as requirements rather than choices. Press conferences cite external reviews and compliance benchmarks. The language shifts. Leaders stop saying, "We decided," and start saying, "We agreed." The Bank for International Settlements has described this moment as one of tightening financial conditions meeting historically high debt stocks. Translated, it means governments are trapped between defending their currencies and financing their populations. Whichever lever they pull, someone absorbs the loss. These pressures feel sudden because they show up everywhere at once. Food, housing, jobs, services. But they aren't new. They follow a sequence that has played out repeatedly whenever borrowing replaces resilience. The surface details change. The strain does not. What looks like a cost of living crisis is often the early stage of something larger. A transfer of economic control that happens gradually, legally, and almost invisibly, until it no longer can be ignored. This has happened before, many times. Not in the same language, not with the same technology, but with the same logic. After World War II, the global economy was shattered. Europe was broke, currencies were unstable, and trade had seized up. In 1944, delegates from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to prevent a repeat of the chaos that had fueled depression and war. Out of that meeting came a new financial architecture, and at its center, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF's mandate was narrow and, at the time, widely supported. Provide short-term balance of payments assistance, stabilize exchange rates, and give countries breathing room after external shocks. The idea was temporary help, not permanent oversight. Loans were supposed to bridge gaps, not redefine domestic policy. Sovereignty was assumed, not questioned. For decades, that system appeared to work. Fixed exchange rates limited volatility. Capital controls reduced sudden outflows. Crises happened, but they were contained. The IMF was a backstop, rarely visible to ordinary people. That changed in the 1970s. When the Bretton Woods system collapsed and currencies began floating, capital moved faster than governments. Oil shocks widened deficits. Interest rates spiked. By the early 1980s, much of Latin America was drowning in dollar-denominated debt it could no longer service after the U.S. raised rates to fight inflation. The IMF stepped in, not as an emergency lender, but as a crisis manager. This is where intent and outcome began to diverge. IMF programs expanded in scope. Loans came with conditions meant to restore confidence. Spending cuts, privatization, currency devaluation, market liberalization. On paper, these reforms were designed to correct imbalances. In practice, they shifted the burden of adjustment inward, onto domestic populations, while ensuring external creditors were paid. The institution didn't create the debt. It organized the response to it. Over time, that response hardened into a template. By the 1990s, this template had been applied across Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. Different political systems, different cultures, same framework. When capital fled and reserves ran dry, the IMF became the gatekeeper. Access to global finance now ran through compliance. Fast forward to the present, and the structure is still in place, just scaled up. According to IMF data updated through 2024, the number of countries facing high debt distress is larger than at any point since the aftermath of World War II. What's different now is not mismanagement, but exposure. Capital flows are faster, debt maturities are shorter, interest rate cycles are sharper. The IMF did not invent debt crises. Governments borrow, markets turn, shocks happen. But the IMF became the institution that standardizes what happens next. It translates crisis into policy and policy into obligation. That role carries power, even when exercised cautiously. Because once a country enters the system, exit becomes difficult. Programs are extended. Targets are revised. Temporary measures linger. What began as assistance became structure. This is the illusion that needs to break. Look, the pressures people feel today are not anomalies of the pandemic era or accidents of bad timing. They are the modern expression of a post-war system under strain, one that was designed to stabilize nations in crisis and now increasingly governs them through it. The story moves forward, but the architecture stays the same. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse, and subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. The trap doesn't snap shut during a crisis. It opens during a boom. Most countries that end up inside IMF programs don't arrive there panicked or desperate. They arrive confident. Growth is strong. Revenues are rising. Global investors are calling. The story, at the time, always sounded reasonable. Throughout the 2010s and into the early 2020s, global liquidity was cheap and abundant. Interest rates in advanced economies stayed near zero for years. Capital searched for yield and found it in emerging and frontier markets. Governments issued bonds in dollars and euros at rates that looked manageable. Commodity exporters benefited from strong prices. GDP climbed. Credit ratings improved. The risk felt distant. Foreign money masked domestic fragility. Rising GDP figures gave the impression of resilience, even when growth was narrow and dependent on external demand. Infrastructure projects multiplied. Subsidies expanded. Public payrolls grew. These moves weren't reckless. They were politically rational. When money is available and growth is visible, restraint looks unnecessary, almost irresponsible. Borrowing in foreign currency became normalized. Dollar-denominated debt was cheaper, faster, and rewarded by markets. The assumption was simple. Growth would continue, exports would cover repayments, and refinancing would always be possible. For years, that assumption held. According to data compiled by the Bank for International Settlements, cross-border lending to emerging markets expanded steadily until global financial conditions began tightening in 2022. This is where the critical decisions are made. Short-term stability consistently wins over long-term resilience. Governments choose to roll over debt rather than build buffers. Reserves are spent smoothing volatility instead of reducing exposure. Structural reforms that limit borrowing power are delayed because they slow growth and upset voters. Political systems reward expansion today and punish caution tomorrow. External debt begins to grow faster than domestic productive capacity. Not dramatically at first, quietly. Each issuance looks manageable in isolation. Collectively, they create dependency. By the time warning signs appear, shorter maturities, higher rollover risk, rising debt service ratios, the system is already leaning on continued access to foreign capital. Recent IMF assessments show this clearly. In multiple countries now classified as high risk or in distress, debt trajectories worsened during periods officially labeled as recovery. Pandemic-era borrowing layered on top of pre-existing obligations. When global interest rates rose sharply starting in 2022, driven largely by policy tightening in the United States, those trajectories broke. The illusion phase is powerful because nothing feels wrong while it's happening. Markets are calm. Growth forecasts are optimistic. Officials point to improving indicators. Critics are dismissed as alarmist. The language is reassuring. Temporary deficits, manageable exposure, sustainable paths. But optimism has a cost. It delays adaptation. It encourages leverage. It convinces governments they have more control than they actually do. By the time conditions reverse, when capital pulls back, currencies weaken, and refinancing costs spike, the choices narrow fast. What looked like flexibility reveals itself as dependence. The borrowing that once felt optional becomes unavoidable. That's the moment optimism ends. Not with collapse, but with realization. The system has a name. It's called the sovereign debt rollover trap. And once it closes, it doesn't need force to work. Here's how it actually happens. A government reaches a point where maturing debt can no longer be refinanced at acceptable market rates. Investors demand higher yields, shorter maturities, or walk away entirely. Currency pressure builds, reserves fall. What looks like a liquidity problem is often a solvency question that no one wants to ask out loud. At that moment, options disappear quickly. Domestic borrowing crowds out private credit. Printing money accelerates inflation and weakens the currency. Default carries political and legal costs that can lock a country out of markets for years. That leaves one remaining door: the International Monetary Fund. IMF lending is framed as stabilization support, but its true function is refinancing control. The fund doesn't replace private markets, it coordinates them. Its loans are designed to reassure external creditors that the country will prioritize repayment, even if that requires internal adjustment. That reassurance comes with conditions. Fiscal consolidation means cutting deficits fast, often during economic slowdowns. Subsidy removal raises prices on fuel, food, and utilities immediately. Currency liberalization exposes households to import inflation overnight. Structural reforms, privatization, labor market changes, tax restructuring are implemented on compressed timelines, not electoral cycles. These measures are not arbitrary. They are meant to restore confidence in the country's ability to service debt. That confidence belongs to bondholders, not citizens. Recent IMF program documents from 2023 through 2025 make this explicit. Targets focus on primary balances, reserve accumulation, and debt-to-GDP stabilization paths. Social spending floors exist, but they are secondary constraints. The core metric is repayment capacity, whether enough cash can be extracted from the domestic economy to meet external obligations. This is the critical distinction most people miss. IMF programs do not optimize for growth quality. They optimize for balance sheet credibility. Stability is defined by whether numbers converge inside a model, not whether living standards recover outside it. A country can meet every benchmark while unemployment rises, wages stagnate, and public services degrade. The Bank for International Settlements has repeatedly warned over the past year that global debt dynamics are becoming self-reinforcing. Higher interest rates raise debt service costs, which force tighter fiscal policy, which slows growth, which worsens debt ratios, requiring further tightening. The loop feeds itself. Once inside this loop, refinancing replaces reform. New loans are used to service old ones. Programs are extended. Conditions are renegotiated, but rarely removed. What began as emergency support becomes a standing framework for governance. The trap isn't hidden. It's documented in program reviews, staff reports, and compliance tables, but it's rarely described in plain language. The country hasn't failed. It's being managed. And management, once handed over, is very difficult to reclaim. Follow the money, and the abstraction disappears. Tax revenue enters the system first. Income taxes, consumption taxes, customs duties, money collected from daily life. That revenue is used to fund services and investment. Now, in many countries under stress, it moves in a different order. Debt service comes first. Interest payments and principal rollovers are wired out on schedule, usually in foreign currency. What remains is divided among everything else. This isn't a theory. IMF program data released over the last year shows debt servicing absorbing an expanding share of government revenue across program countries, even as headline deficits narrow. In several cases, interest payments now exceed spending on health or education. The numbers balance. Society doesn't. Domestic consumption shrinks to keep external obligations intact. Governments cut fuel subsidies to save cash, knowing transport costs will rise across the economy. Utility prices are adjusted upward to reflect market conditions. Public hiring freezes limit wage growth even as prices climb. Each measure is defensible on its own. Together, they extract demand from the population to preserve liquidity for repayment. When revenues fall short, new borrowing fills the gap. But this borrowing no longer funds development. It services existing debt. IMF disbursements unlock additional financing from development banks and bilateral lenders, much of which cycles straight back out to creditors. The money enters, turns, and leaves. Very little stays. The Bank for International Settlements has described this dynamic as a maturity mismatch problem compounded by currency risk. In plain terms, countries earn in local currency, owe in dollars, and must convert domestic pain into external payment. Every depreciation raises the cost. Every rate hike tightens the vice. Think of it as a pressure system. External obligations set the pressure level. Governments can release pressure by cutting spending, raising taxes, or selling assets. These are the relief valves. Social programs are thinned out. Infrastructure is deferred. Public wages lag behind inflation. Each release prevents rupture, but none reduce the pressure itself. The obligation remains. As long as the structure holds, the system appears stable. Budgets meet targets. Reviews are passed. Markets remain open. From the outside, it looks like discipline. From the inside, it feels like compression. What makes this system durable is that it avoids visible collapse. No single moment triggers alarm. Living standards slide gradually. Services degrade unevenly. Inequality widens. Those with assets protect themselves. Those without absorb the loss. IMF program language reinforces this stability. Reports speak of adjustment fatigue and implementation risks, but benchmarks remain quantitative. If the numbers add up, the program is working. Whether people can afford food, housing, or electricity is treated as a secondary variable. Over time, the economy adapts downward. Businesses invest less. Skilled workers leave. Consumption patterns reset lower. Growth slows, which worsens debt ratios, which justifies continued tightening. The pressure never releases, it circulates. That's the key takeaway. A country doesn't collapse under this system. Collapse would force resolution. Instead, it is hollowed out. Capacity drained. Options narrowed. Control transferred incrementally. By the time the structure finally cracks, most of what made it resilient is already gone. The system insists this time is different. History disagrees. In the late 1970s, Latin America looked like a growth story. Oil exporters recycled petrodollars through global banks, and cheap credit flooded the region. Governments borrowed heavily in US dollars to fund development, industrialization, and social programs. For a while, it worked. Growth was real. Living standards rose. Confidence followed. Then interest rates changed. When the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker pushed rates sharply higher to crush U.S. inflation, dollar funding costs exploded almost overnight. Latin American currencies weakened. Debt service doubled, then tripled. Countries that had been solvent on paper were suddenly locked out of markets. Mexico's 1982 default wasn't an isolated failure. It was the signal. What followed was IMF-led adjustment across the region. Emergency loans came with conditions: spending cuts, privatization, currency devaluation, wage restraint. The goal was stabilization. The result was contraction. Throughout the 1980s, much of Latin America experienced what economists later called the lost decade. Per capita incomes stagnated or fell. Investment collapsed. Poverty rose. Debt ratios improved slowly, but growth never recovered its earlier trajectory. Different governments tried different approaches. None escaped the sequence. Fast forward to Southern Europe after 2008. The context looked nothing like Latin America. These were advanced economies inside a shared currency, backed by sophisticated institutions. Yet the pattern resurfaced with familiar precision. After the global financial crisis, countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain lost market access as bond yields spiked. Bailout programs coordinated with the International Monetary Fund imposed strict fiscal consolidation. Budgets were cut during recessions. Taxes rose as incomes fell. Public assets were sold under pressure. Youth unemployment climbed above 50% in some cases. Entire cohorts delayed work, migration, and family formation. Political systems fractured under the strain. New parties rose promising relief. Old ones collapsed under blame. Even after headline stabilization, productivity growth lagged. A decade later, output paths remained permanently lower than pre-crisis trends. The details differed. The currencies were different. The politics were different. The mechanism was not. In both cases, rapid borrowing during favorable conditions met an external shock. Market access closed. Multilateral support arrived with conditions designed to secure repayment. Adjustment was pushed inward. Growth slowed. Debt dynamics stabilized only after long-term damage was done. Recent IMF research acknowledges this pattern obliquely. Staff papers now speak of scarring effects and persistent output losses following adjustment-heavy programs. The language is careful. The math is not. Once investment collapses and human capital leaves, recovery becomes arithmetic, not ambition. This repetition matters because it strips away excuses. These outcomes weren't caused by culture, geography, or bad luck. They emerged from the same sequence applied under different flags, different eras, different societies, same leverage, same shock, same response. The pattern holds because it is structural. And structures, once built, don't need intent to repeat themselves. History doesn't repeat cleanly. It compresses. After 2020, governments did what they were expected to do. They borrowed. Pandemic shutdowns collapsed tax revenues overnight. Health systems needed funding immediately. Supply chains broke. Emergency spending wasn't optional. It was survival. Global debt expanded at a speed without precedent in peacetime. What was supposed to be temporary never fully reversed. By 2023 and into 2024, sovereign debt levels across emerging and middle-income countries had locked in at far higher baselines. According to updated assessments from the International Monetary Fund, global public debt reached levels not seen since the aftermath of World War II, even as growth slowed. The cushion that once existed, low interest rates, was gone. Inflation forced central banks to move fast. So the Federal Reserve raised rates at the sharpest pace in 4 decades. Other central banks followed, not because their economies were overheating, but because failing to do so risked currency collapse. The dollar surged. For countries with dollar-denominated debt, the math turned hostile. This is where the modern parallel tightens. Emerging market currencies weakened just as refinancing costs rose. Debt that looked sustainable at 2 or 3% interest became unmanageable at 7 or 8. According to the Bank for International Settlements, the share of global debt exposed to short-term repricing has increased significantly since 2021, amplifying rollover risk. Maturity walls are closer now. There's less room to maneuver. IMF program density reflects this pressure. Over the last 18 months, new and expanded IMF arrangements have spread across Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America, and smaller economies once considered insulated. These aren't isolated rescues. They form a map, a concentration of stress where global liquidity has retreated fastest. What's different this time is the sequence. In the past, inflation shocks often triggered debt crises, oil spikes, currency pegs breaking, sudden price surges. Governments borrowed to smooth the damage. Today, the order has flipped. Massive debt expansion came first. Inflation followed. Now higher interest rates are locking that debt in place under far worse terms. The destination hasn't changed. Debt service is rising faster than growth. Fiscal space is shrinking even in nominal recovery. Governments are cutting spending not during collapse, but during fragile stabilization. That combination is historically dangerous. It suppresses investment, just as economies need it to rebuild capacity. Cold War comparisons are not rhetorical here. The IMF's own risk assessments now show a larger share of the world's population living in countries facing elevated debt distress than at any time since the 1980s. What's new is scale. The system is more interconnected. Capital moves faster. Shocks transmit instantly. This isn't about one country failing. It's about a structure under strain everywhere at once. History hasn't ended. It's accelerated. And the same mechanism that once hollowed out regions over decades is now doing it in real time. Quietly, contractually, and under the language of stabilization. The pattern hasn't changed. Only the speed has. The bill never arrives addressed to a balance sheet. It lands on people. Middle-class households absorb it first, quietly, through taxes that rise while services shrink, and through inflation that outpaces paychecks. Value-added taxes expand because they are easy to collect. Utility fees climb because subsidies are cut. Import prices jump when currencies weaken. None of this shows up as a single decision, but the effect is cumulative. A family that could once save now treads water. A household that felt stable begins borrowing just to maintain routine. Workers carry the next layer of the burden. Wage growth stalls under competitiveness, mandates meant to restore confidence. Public sector hiring freezes become permanent. Private employers follow suit as demand weakens. According to recent IMF program reviews, labor market flexibility is often encouraged during adjustment. Code for wages adjusting downward faster than prices. Employment may technically recover, but bargaining power does not. People work more hours for less security. Young people pay the longest price. When public investment contracts and private credit tightens, opportunity narrows. Entry-level jobs disappear first. Training budgets are cut. Housing costs stay high while incomes lag. The rational response is exit. Emigration becomes a pressure valve, draining skilled labor precisely when economies need it most. This isn't cultural preference, it's arithmetic. When the future offers less than the past, people leave. The lived effects are visible long before reports acknowledge them. Hospitals run short of basic supplies, not because doctors vanish, but because procurement budgets are delayed or denominated in foreign currency that's suddenly more expensive. Schools stay open but underfunded. Class sizes grow. Maintenance is deferred. Infrastructure decays in plain sight. Roads patched instead of rebuilt. Power grids strained. Water systems aging. While debt payments are executed on time. Every time. Recent fiscal data tells the story bluntly. In several countries under adjustment, interest payments now exceed capital spending. Money flows outward with precision while domestic capacity erodes unevenly. The International Monetary Fund tracks these numbers as ratios. Families experience them as absences. What makes this phase difficult to confront is its deniability. There is no single catastrophe to point to. No sudden collapse. Life continues, just diminished. And each year feels slightly harder than the last. People adapt downward. Expectations reset. What once felt temporary starts to feel normal. The Bank for International Settlements has warned that prolonged fiscal compression can entrench low growth and widen inequality. Translated, it means the system extracts resilience faster than it can be rebuilt. Those with assets shield themselves. Those without absorb volatility directly. This is where abstraction fails. Debt ratios can stabilize. Programs can be extended. Reviews can be passed. None of that restores the lost years, the deferred care, the abandoned plans. Economic adjustment has a human half-life, and it's measured in lives redirected, not spreadsheets balanced. The debt remains an entry on a ledger. The cost shows up in emptied classrooms, understaffed clinics, and a generation taught by experience that stability no longer belongs to them. Numbers don't feel pain. People do. There is a point where crisis management turns into permanent condition. Not because anyone declares it so, but because the exits quietly disappear. The point of no return arrives when debt servicing consumes fiscal flexibility. When interest payments harden into fixed obligations that outrank every other priority. When budgets are written backward, starting with what must be paid abroad before anything can be decided at home. At that stage, policy stops being strategic. It becomes procedural. You can see it in the language. Governments stop debating options and start reporting compliance. Targets replace plans. Reviews replace elections as the moments that matter most. When policy space narrows this far, voting changes faces but not direction. Different parties inherit the same constraints. The same letters arrive. The same benchmarks apply. Recent IMF program structures make this explicit. Multi-year arrangements now extend beyond single political terms, locking in fiscal paths that survive leadership changes. According to updated program data through 2024, many countries face debt service profiles that peak years after elections are held. The decisions that bind them are already made. Democratic choice remains, but its economic reach is shortened. Reversal sounds simple in theory. Cut ties, default, print, walk away. In practice, it's punishing. Exiting the system requires short-term pain with no immediate political reward. Default collapses credit access and spikes inflation. Capital controls trigger shortages. Currency breaks erase savings overnight. Leaders who attempt sharp deviation face instant pressure from markets, from trade partners, from domestic groups whose assets are exposed. The backlash is faster than the recovery. The longer dependence continues, the higher the cost of leaving. Debt maturities shorten. Reserve buffers are thin. Domestic institutions adapt to external oversight. Entire bureaucracies reorganize around compliance. At some point, independence becomes riskier than submission. This is not accidental. The International Monetary Fund does not enforce obedience through force. It doesn't need to. The structure does the work. The Bank for International Settlements has warned that prolonged debt dependence reshapes incentives inside governments themselves. Officials become managers of constraint rather than architects of growth. Stability becomes the ceiling, not the floor. Here is the lesson that matters. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern. You can trace it across decades, continents, and political systems. Borrowing fills gaps. Shocks expose dependence. Adjustment secures repayment. Capacity erodes. Options narrow. Control transfers incrementally, contract by contract, review by review. Nations no longer fall to conquest. They drift, quietly, into constraint. No banners come down, no declarations are signed. The handover happens in spreadsheets, maturity schedules, and policy memos. By the time it's recognized as loss, it's already normalized. Understanding this pattern doesn't guarantee escape, but it is the first defense against living inside it without knowing why.